Welcome back to the City Rev Life Podcast. I am Pastor Robey. I am here with Pastor Muche. If you joined us for the first part of this mini-series, we went on and on about how much we love Pastor Muche. And glad that he's back. We love the brook in North Miami. And so glad that you're here, Muche. So we've been talking about the idea of God's passion for life, for justice, that is a source that leads us to all kinds of advocacy. Mm-hmm. And in the last episode, we were talking about Martin Luther King Jr. Day and his legacy, that he's actually just following in the legacy of Christ. We talked about that. I want to encourage you to go back and check on that. Today, we are, in this episode, talking about what sometimes in some churches celebrate a Sanctity of Human Life weekend. And typically what's meant by that is advocating for the unborn. Yeah. So it's talking about issues of abortion and protecting both women and children in that context. And so sometimes those issues of addressing racial injustice and the issues of justice towards the unborn, sometimes those issues are separated, and there are certainly implications socially, systemically, that are distinct of those. But what we're doing in this series is talking about how they're actually flowing from the same source, and that as we are framing up our minds biblically, following Jesus and the footsteps of Jesus, we will be passionate about both those issues.
1,000%, man. So if, from an advocacy standpoint, if we use the working theory of advocacy as voice and visibility for the vulnerable, flowing out of a heart of compassion, right? So that would be it. What makes someone most vulnerable is that their essential rights, rights that are inherent to what it means to be human. So their essential rights, their experience of a quality of life, are threatened. So it seems like that becomes a framework of understanding what makes somebody vulnerable. Your essential rights and your capacity to experience a quality of life in view of being human and in view of the grace of God are being threatened, and that makes you vulnerable. And so essentially your essential humanity is attacked. Yeah. You're having aspects of your essential humanity to be made in the image of God. This is how we understand what makes us unique and different in all of creation. God announces this blessing over us. So let us make man in our likeness, in our image. It's profound. And so that is being stripped. All people who are vulnerable are having their imago Dei threatened and stripped. And so
Imago
that's
Dei being
made in the image of God. And so that could occur on racial lines. That could occur on economic lines. That could occur on gender lines. That could occur geographically, sojourner, or it could just occur in the core of being human. And then this category of people who don't have the same capacity to advocate for themselves, children.
I think that's really important how you're defining that, in that Genesis 1, the beginning.
It really does matter.
The first description of humanity is that we're made in God's image. So that is inherently what the enemy over and over attacks. He's trying to strip us of the gift, the profound honor of being made in God's image, and stripping the dignity of humanity. So when a woman is sex trafficked and she's viewed as an object.
Come on.
She's being stripped, or a man that's being sex trafficked. They're being stripped of their dignity of a human. They're being turned into an object. Sure. When a person is stolen into slavery, they are being stripped of their dignity as if they're a piece of property.
Yep.
When an elderly person is neglected as someone who is more of a burden than an actual human being to be honored, that person is being stripped of their dignity. And we can go on and on and on through all different frameworks of oppression. But the same thing is at work when it comes to the devil, the enemy, the work of evil, stripping people of the image of God. And so, and you were talking earlier about kind of the quartet of the vulnerable. And walk us through that.
Yeah, can I be spicy for a moment based on what you just said? Like, if what you articulated was a stripping of humanity, like it almost feels spicy. I like Jesus. I like spicy Jesus. That's what Jesus is spicy. So I'm going to be spicy. Where it's like people who talk about human rights, you can't talk about human rights cohesively or comprehensively independent from Christianity.
Wow.
I just don't think it's possible, because Christianity creates the most powerful statement of what it means to be human. And not just the most powerful, but the truest statement as well. And so it's just interesting because you went down the categories of oppression, people who are experiencing real-time oppression and need their essential rights, their essential human rights advocated for, protected, and pursued. And it's like, but you can't really talk about that competently, cohesively, or comprehensively apart from Christianity. You'll say some things, but it'll be limited at best. So that's spicy. That's as spicy as I'm getting.
And no, I think that's good. And I think what I know you mean by that is not the caricature of Christianity. Not the cultural version of Christianity, not random YouTuber version of Christianity.
No, sir.
You're talking about biblical, Christ-centered, gospel-saturated, biblical Christianity. And I think that's absolutely true. And so what we're talking, okay, let me get us back to our
top. I'm sorry for the spicy detour. Let me drink coffee.
All right, you drink some coffee for a second. Let me get us back on track.
Coffee, my dad.
Here is the four categories that we typically talk about. We talk about the orphan, the widow, the sojourner, and what am I forgetting? The orphan, the widow, the sojourner, and the poor. So you have, those are the four, the quartet. All of those in ways can be, when they are degraded of their humanity, all four of those are oppressed in different ways historically.
Yeah, facts.
We're talking in this episode about specifically the orphan as a category for children.
Yes,
and
that's good. That's good, bro.
And children are very, very profoundly vulnerable in that they cannot advocate for themselves. Specifically in the conversation of the sanctity of human life, there is a space where children or an unborn child is downgraded from a being made in the image of God to an object. And I think this is where language matters. Speak to that.
Yeah. I think socially we wouldn't say it this strongly, but it seems to show up in many ways functionally, that children are treated as subhumans. And I think it does show up explicitly by looking at unborn children primarily through the lens of DNA, fetus, a clump of cells versus personhood. And I think it's a common expression of dehumanizing someone. And dehumanizing is something that, again, I would say from a Christian perspective, is something that Satan does frequently. And so a common expression of dehumanizing is how you talk about somebody. And so if I talk about a person as if they're not a person, I am dehumanizing them, and I'm stripping them of the things that make them beautiful and true. And Psalm 139, among other places, it really creates this pretty powerful starting point for life in the womb.
Can I just read it? I think it's so Psalm 139. I'm just reading 13 through 16. For you formed my inward parts. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them.
Yeah, I feel like we, at least historically, I've always heard this, or often heard this, flowery. Like, man, this is the stuff of like Christian paraphernalia. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like t-shirts,
Crochet.
like yeah, it's like that. This it loses its ferocity. Like, this is the weight here is like he said, there are days that were formed for me when as yet there was none of them. Like, the intentionality of God for an individual life is profound. It's utterly ridiculous that the supreme being, the ruler of heaven and earth, who holds all life in his hand, has the attentiveness to one individual life to form days for that person. Like, it matters. And so it's often flowery, but I'm like, man, there's a foundational truth here, truths that are just, I'm rampant. Go ahead.
Yeah,
man.
no, I think it just clearly saying God is at work in the womb. God doesn't start being, even before his work at the work, he's planned out the days. There is life inside the womb. And to what you're saying is downgrading it from being a human to a fetus, or a baby to a fetus. Pregnancy is what's happening to a woman's body, but that's not all that's happening. There is a soul, a baby, a person in there. And it's easier to talk about terminating a pregnancy, but there is a person. There is person that God is at work. I think about, when the baby in Elizabeth's body, John the Baptist, was in the presence of the baby in Mary's body,
Luke,
Jesus. Baby. Yeah. He prophesied. He leapt in her womb. He's worshiping the presence of Jesus. That's significant. There are things that are happening in that person. And so language matters. And the idea of downgrading a human to a fetus that's a noted shift in attempting to downgrade the dignity of being made in the image of God.
Yeah, it's a shift, and it's not a scientific one. It's a social one, and I think just need to be honest with that. And I think part of what I've seen as of late, all the more, is conversations regarding agency. And in those conversations regarding agency, agency isn't assigned to babies because they're not seen as babies, clumps of cells. And that's why that language matters as well, because if they are a person, their agency does matter. And so the conversation needs to be a little bit more thoughtful in terms of advocacy for their agency, that they might experience the fullness of life that's warranted to them by being made in the image of God. And there's all sorts of other necessary conversations around that. But I don't think it's fair or helpful if that part of the conversation is neglected, or if it's only seen through the lens of culture war and politics, and not the lens of scripture and humanity,
right,
and advocacy that flows out of voice and visibility for the vulnerable, because you have a heart of compassion.
Yeah, and what we talked about in the last episode applies here as well. Jesus it elevates the conversation beyond the earthly categories. And he elevates it as part of, he's setting up a new kingdom of heaven, and he's calling us to be citizens of the kingdom of heaven. So issues like this is protecting an unborn child or a born child, or any vulnerable person being stripped of their dignity is something that we talk about, not because we're part of one system or the other, but we talk about because we are citizens of the kingdom of heaven, and we advocate for those things. And so these are things that we all, in the same way we are for all those. We are for protecting all of those who are experiencing the stripping of their humanity or their dignity, or are vulnerable. Absolutely, we want to be talking about this. And so maybe speak a little bit to Muche, why children in particular, all are vulnerable in their own ways, but children are very, very vulnerable.
Yeah, it's from womb to birth, in adolescence to adulthood, they're entirely dependent.
Mm-hmm.
And you start to measure vulnerability not just through dehumanizing activity, but through experiences of dependence. And they're entirely dependent. And if I'm entirely dependent on somebody else to help me experience what I need most, like, I'm in a vulnerable position. And so it just feels like the dependency of children, both from a mental capacity, kind of like what you were talking about, kind of some offline conversations, not as if their mental faculties are less than because they're not whatever, but just the nature of like access to information. They're just, so mental capacity, but then also physical capacity. Like, you know what I'm saying? Why they're easily abused after they're born, man. And so, so just their entire life until adulthood is one of dependency. And so children are vulnerable from the womb to birth. In adolescence, they're often more vulnerable to ideas than physical aggression.
That's good.
Into adulthood.
I think that attacking children is a historical, consistent part of the enemy's strategy, and advocating for children is a historical part of the Christian legacy. And so maybe in a moment you can speak to that part, the historical part. But I even think idolatry in its most, just thinking biblically, in the history of the Bible, the most wicked, dark, demonic forms of idolatry led to child sacrifice.
Yes.
And so watch the course of evil. It wants to prey on the most vulnerable in a society, and it will always come for children. And so in my mind, in the same way we link injustice, and we talked about in the previous episode, to a spiritual issue, injustice towards children, both unborn and born, is a deep demonic darkness. And the more voiceless one is, the more they are dependent on our advocacy.
Yes.
And so a child doesn't even have the mental capacity often if they're young enough to even realize they're being abused or oppressed. How much more in that case an unborn child needs and requires advocacy. And that's been the historical legacy of those walking in Christian faith.
Yeah, man. So the conversation itself has contours, right? And one of those contours is ethics. There's ethical questions, ideas associated with this conversation. I think the Sanctity of Life Day is an opportunity to reflect on what it means to be human, how that humanity should be protected and the quality of life should be pursued. And it's a conversation around ethics. And so for me, not as spicy as before, but I just think Christian ethics applied rightly. When I say Christian ethics, I mean ethics that flow out of a Christian understanding of life, to see with God's eyes. I think Christian ethics applied rightly leads societies into flourishing. I think they're transformative. And so this goes back to the historic piece. So like, I think the epistle of Diognetus, and so many people recognize it as like an early apologetic of the veracity, the truthfulness of Christianity, right?
That's a letter in, what is it, the 2nd or 3rd century?
I think 2nd. Yeah.
Okay.
We're going to say 2nd.
We're going to go,
but somebody is going to fact check us.
Yes.
And it's
go for it.
It's going to be great. But there's one portion of the letter that I just wanted to read out, if that was cool.
Do it.
He's talking about Christians' activity in society. It says this: as citizens, they share in all things with others, and yet endure all things as foreigners. Every foreign land is to them as their native country, and every land of their birth as a land of strangers. I think that kind of speaks to what you're talking about. Like, their citizenship is being influenced from on high, which allows them to be real citizens in real time to wherever they are. But this is the part that becomes ethical for me, right? They marry, as do all others. They beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. That's transformational. It was wild to say that we are going to give intentional energy to protecting our offspring, that their utility is not what warrants them dignity. It's the fact that they're human and made in the image of God. So they beget children, but they do not destroy their offspring. They have a common table, but not a common bed. I love that. Like, it's the idea that they share all things in common, the poor being taken care of, but they're not sharing the marriage bed.
Right.
And so those are transformational sexual ethics as well. And so this is part of our legacy. This transformed the society, like how they viewed and then subsequently treated the vulnerable,
right,
and how they applied their faith ethically shaped the world.
Yeah.
So it really is our heritage, man.
Yeah. In other words, just to say it as flatly as possible, in the 2nd, 3rd century, Christians were fighting abortion. They were fighting when...
That's a really good way to say that.
They were fighting abortion, and that was a key part of...
Fighting baby killing.
Yeah, they stood against that. They understood the inherent dignity of babies, and when their culture was practicing infanticide, killing their offspring usually by in many ways, but one of the prominent ones was exposure. They would leave them out in a field unattended to die, and that still happens in our world today in some countries. And so Christians would find them and raise them, and they would protect these babies, and they were known for that. And so, in the same way, kind of to bring it back together, the same legacy of Christ, which is to stand for the vulnerable, leads us to advocate for justice, whether you're born or unborn, because that dehumanizing work happens in all different kinds of categories, and we stand by the truth that all men and women are created in the image of God, and so we advocate for those. And so, what are you looking up? You got something on your mind? I see. You're looking up something.
Fam. So it's Ezekiel 16, man. It's one of my favorite ways of understanding the gospel. And and when you're talking about just left abandoned, like Ezekiel 16:6, and when I passed by you, I saw you wallowing in your blood, and I said to you in your blood, live. I said to you in your blood, live. I made you flourish like a plant of the field, and you grew up and became tall and arrived at full adornment. And it's like, there was just that sense where you were abandoned. You were not wanted, but I saw you differently. And part of that is because
God's saying that to Israel.
This is what God was saying to Israel. And so like, it just feels like when we, again, just thinking about the advocacy that matters, because again, some of these ideas, the right activity has been hijacked often. And it's like, it's not merely like I'm doing the right things, but the heart posture, the perspective, how I'm seeing you, what's moving me to action actually matters. And so it's not merely resisting infanticide, right?
Yeah.
It is the pursuit of human flourishing. I am pursuing your good. I am pursuing the good of all people in view of the image of God, being made in his image. It's on them. So I'm pursuing it in view of that, but I'm pursuing it in view of the gospel, because the ultimate good one could experience is life with God forever. It's not just natural good, it's eternal good. But I'm pursuing your good in view of both, if that makes sense. And so, so that's, as you're talking, that's where my mind goes, this, it's the perspective that transforms our actions and not just the actions themselves.
That's incredible. Ezekiel 16, maybe a takeaway as we're entering into this weekend, Sanctity of Human Life. maybe a takeaway is spend some time reading that and realize that is our story
Yes.
of God loving us in that way. And then in the same way, we also, I mean, that's really the gospel heart of compassion, is over and over and over. That is what God has done for me. And so that is what then I turn around and do for others. So thank you, Muche. Appreciate this discussion, man. When it comes to justice, no matter what a human we're talking about, they're made in the image of God. We stand against anything that dehumanizes someone. And so I hope this has been a helpful podcast series. Grateful to Muche, Pastor Muche, and the Brook. And I hope you've enjoyed this City Rev podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for listening to the City Rev Life Podcast. Feel free to subscribe and leave a rate and review. And we love it when you share it with your friends on social media. So don't forget to tag us at cityrev.church. If you're interested in more resources, download our City Rev Church app and follow us on social media. Thank you so much and have a great day.